If you are seeing this, the phase already ended. Not recently. Not moments ago. It ended before you ever pressed play. That is the part most minds struggle to accept, because the mind is trained to look for transition, for movement, for effort still underway. Yet what brought you here is not momentum. It is aftermath. You are not in the middle of the post-observer phase. You are arriving after its closure, standing in the quiet that follows completion, interpreting stillness as uncertainty only because you were conditioned to equate effort with progress. The confusion you may be feeling is not a sign that something went wrong. It is the natural disorientation that occurs when a structure dissolves without drama. The neutrality, the lack of urgency, the absence of hunger to fix or manifest or improve anything, these are not symptoms of loss. They are confirmations. They are what remains when the phase built on striving has done its work and quietly stepped aside. There is no celebration because completion does not announce itself. It stabilizes. It settles. It leaves no friction because friction belonged to the phase that required pushing. For a long time, your inner world was defined by motion. There was always something to align, something to clear, something to become. That movement created meaning. But phases do not end with fireworks. They end with silence. And silence, to a system accustomed to constant instruction, feels like something is missing. Nothing is missing. Something unnecessary has fallen away. The post-observer phase was never meant to be permanent. It was a bridge, not a residence. Once the crossing is complete, standing on the bridge feels pointless. Yet many people mistake that pointlessness for failure instead of recognizing it as arrival. Notice how this message does not ask you to do anything. There is no technique being offered, no next step being prescribed. That alone should tell you where you are. This is not a call to action. It is a recognition. You are not being pulled forward. You are being met where you already are. The part of you that once needed constant reinforcement has relaxed, and the mind, deprived of its familiar role, interprets that relaxation as uncertainty. But uncertainty only exists when a future outcome is being chased. When the chase ends, the uncertainty dissolves with it. You did not stop because you gave up. You stopped because there was nothing left to push against. The field you once tried to influence is no longer experienced as external, and so effort has nowhere to go. This is why trying to re-engage old methods now feels hollow or even irritating. It is not because they failed. It is because they succeeded completely. They brought you to the point where they are no longer needed. Let this land without analysis. You are not early. You are not late. You are not stuck. You are standing after closure, interpreting stability through a lens built for movement. Recognition, not effort, is what resolves this tension. Nothing needs to be restarted. Nothing needs to be fixed. This is what it feels like when a phase ends cleanly. If you are aligned with this recognition, subscribe and remain within this frequency. What you are feeling now is not resistance from reality. It is resistance between identities. That distinction matters, because resistance implies something pushing back, something external refusing to cooperate. That is not what is happening. What is happening is simpler and more precise. The tools you are reaching for belong to a version of you that no longer exists in the same way, and the friction you feel is the signal of that mismatch. Visualization, intention, discipline, sustained effort, these once worked because they were appropriate to the phase you were in. They were designed for a consciousness that experienced itself as separate from the field, a consciousness that needed to focus, strain, and direct energy outward in order to collapse possibility into experience. In that context, effort was not a flaw. It was the mechanism. The strain was the bridge. The heaviness you endured was the cost of operating from separation, and you paid it willingly because it produced results. But once unity stabilizes, those same actions no longer land the same way. They begin to feel heavy, awkward, even irritating. Not because you lost your ability to manifest, but because the premise behind those actions is no longer true for you. Visualization assumes a future you must bring into being. Intention assumes distance between here and there. Discipline assumes something unruly must be controlled. Effort assumes resistance is required for movement. Each of these assumptions quietly declares separation. And when separation is no longer your lived reality, the body and nervous system register that declaration as strain. This is why trying harder now feels worse, not better. You are not meeting resistance from the field. You are generating internal incoherence by attempting to operate from an outdated identity. The field is not pushing back. It is simply not responding to instructions that contradict your current state of being. This is not punishment. It is precision. The system you are now operating within is far less tolerant of misalignment because it no longer buffers you with delay. It is important to remove all self-blame here. Nothing has gone wrong. You did not lose discipline. You did not become lazy. You did not fall out of alignment. What ended was the usefulness of force. When unity stabilizes, effort becomes redundant. Not morally wrong. Redundant. Like speaking loudly in a room where everyone can already hear you. The loudness is not harmful, but it is unnecessary, and the body knows it. Notice how even the idea of trying to surrender feels absurd now. That is because surrender cannot be performed by effort. Any attempt to re-engage the old methods creates friction because those methods were built to solve a problem that no longer exists. They were scaffolding. And scaffolding feels like an obstacle once the structure stands on its own. The friction you feel is actually guidance. It is the system informing you that you are applying force where recognition is required. Not by rejecting your past practices, but by outgrowing their purpose. This is not a call to find better techniques. It is an invitation to stop looking for techniques altogether. When effort stops working, it is not because you need to refine it. It is because effort has completed its role. There is nothing to fix here. There is nothing to overcome. The heaviness is simply the sensation of wearing clothes that no longer fit. You are not meant to push through it. You are meant to notice it, recognize what it signifies, and let the mismatch resolve itself by no longer insisting on being who you have already moved beyond. Completion does not arrive with a feeling of victory. It does not come with excitement, relief, or a surge of clarity that announces itself as an achievement. Completion arrives quietly. So quietly that most people miss it, not because they are unaware, but because they are trained to look for noise. They expect progress to feel like movement, and when movement stops, they assume something has stalled. In reality, what has stalled is only the habit of striving. Stillness is the first signal. Not forced stillness, not meditation-induced calm, but an unremarkable absence of internal pressure. The sense that nothing needs immediate attention. No inner alarm demanding improvement, healing, manifestation, or correction. This stillness often feels unfamiliar because it offers no task. There is nothing to grip, nothing to optimize. And because the mind equates value with activity, it interprets this as emptiness. But emptiness is not what is present. What is present is saturation. The system is no longer pulling forward because it has nothing left to chase. Neutrality follows naturally. Emotional neutrality is often misunderstood as detachment or numbness, but this neutrality is neither. It is responsiveness without reactivity. Events still register, information still arrives, but the nervous system no longer spikes in response. This is not suppression. It is stabilization. The body has stopped bracing for impact because it no longer perceives itself as navigating an unstable environment. The absence of emotional highs and lows is not a loss of depth. It is the removal of unnecessary oscillation. Alongside neutrality comes the disappearance of urgency. Urgency is a product of perceived lack. It arises when the system believes something essential is missing and must be obtained quickly to restore balance. When urgency fades, it is tempting to assume motivation has been lost. In truth, urgency dissolves when balance is restored. The drive to hurry only exists when the present moment is experienced as insufficient. When sufficiency becomes the baseline, urgency has no function. The absence of seeking is perhaps the most disorienting signal. Seeking once gave structure to identity. There was always another insight to find, another layer to peel back, another state to reach. When seeking ends, the mind feels briefly unmoored. Not because direction is gone, but because the compass has stopped spinning. The destination is no longer ahead. It is underfoot. And that realization does not excite the system. It calms it. Your nervous system reflects this completion long before the mind understands it. Muscles release chronic tension without effort. Breathing deepens naturally. Attention widens instead of narrowing. These are not signs of disengagement. They are signs that vigilance is no longer required. The system is no longer preparing for a future event that must be managed or controlled. Silence, then, is not a void. It is a signal. It is what remains when the work of becoming has finished and the system has returned to coherence. There is no message hidden in the silence, no instruction waiting to be decoded. The silence itself is the confirmation. The phase did not end loudly because it did not need to. It ended cleanly. And clean endings do not demand attention. They simply leave nothing unresolved behind. This section is not about introducing something new. It is about naming precisely what ended, so you do not keep carrying an identity that no longer has a function. What ended was not growth, awareness, or expansion. What ended was becoming. And until that is seen clearly, the mind will continue trying to restart a process that has already completed. Becoming is not a universal law. It is a strategy. It only exists when consciousness experiences itself as separate from what it seeks. You become when you believe you are not yet what you need to be. You strive when you assume something essential lies ahead in time. Becoming requires distance. It requires a future self, a future state, a future arrival point that justifies effort in the present. As long as separation feels real, becoming feels necessary. It gives structure, purpose, and direction. But once separation collapses, becoming loses its foundation. There is no future version of you to move toward when identity stabilizes in the present. The moment consciousness no longer experiences itself as lacking, the logic of becoming dissolves. This is not an achievement. It is a natural consequence. You did not finish becoming by reaching a peak. You finished it by no longer needing it. Arrival, then, is not a dramatic moment. It is a baseline shift. Arrival means the sense of not yet is gone. Not replaced by excitement, but by sufficiency. Nothing feels unfinished. Nothing feels urgent. Nothing feels like it requires improvement in order for life to proceed. This is where confusion often enters, because the mind expects arrival to feel like success. Instead, it feels like neutrality. And neutrality is difficult to interpret when you are trained to equate movement with meaning. Acting from completion does not mean doing nothing. It means action no longer comes from projection. You are not acting to secure a future state. You are acting as an expression of what is already stable. There is no internal negotiation, no silent question of whether this will get you closer to who you are trying to become. That question no longer arises because there is no one you are trying to become. Action becomes situational, immediate, and unburdened by outcome. This is also why acting as if stops making sense here. Acting as if still implies pretending. It implies you are rehearsing for something that has not yet arrived. Acting from completion is not rehearsal. It is response. You do not behave like someone who has arrived. You behave as someone who is not on their way anywhere. The difference is subtle but absolute. The discomfort many people feel at this stage comes from letting go of the narrative that gave effort its justification. Becoming gave you a reason to push. Without it, the system must learn how to move without tension. That recalibration can feel empty at first, not because nothing is happening, but because nothing is being chased. This is not the end of engagement with life. It is the end of chasing life through time. When becoming ends, presence begins without effort. And presence does not announce itself. It simply operates. Like the video now as a confirmation that this recognition has landed. At some point, the intensity of wanting simply faded. Not because you suppressed it, and not because you stopped caring, but because the engine that produced desire no longer had a function. This is often misread as loss of ambition or passion, yet what actually disappeared was not desire itself, but the tension underneath it. Desire, as it once operated, was powered by lack. It was the emotional momentum generated by the belief that something essential was missing and had to be obtained to restore balance. When separation was active, desire was necessary. It created movement. It gave the system a reason to push forward, to visualize, to strive, to hold a future state as more real than the present. The ache of wanting was not a flaw in that phase. It was the fuel. Without lack, there would have been no propulsion. Without longing, there would have been no motivation to bridge the perceived distance between who you were and who you thought you needed to become. But once unity stabilizes, lack no longer organizes experience. When identity is no longer structured around absence, the emotional charge that once fueled desire collapses on its own. There is nothing wrong with this. You are not losing your edge. You are losing the illusion that something outside of you is required to complete you. The system no longer generates hunger because hunger only exists when something is believed to be missing. What replaces intense desire is not indifference. It is calm preference. Preference does not pull. It does not ache. It does not demand. It simply orients. You may still prefer certain experiences, environments, expressions, or forms, but that preference is no longer tied to your sense of wholeness. You are not reaching for abundance to feel abundant. You are abundance, and preference becomes the way abundance expresses itself in form. You are not seeking love to feel complete. You are wholeness, and preference becomes how wholeness shares itself. This shift can feel disconcerting because the emotional spikes that once accompanied wanting are gone. There is less excitement, less anticipation, less dramatic contrast. But what is gained is stability. The nervous system no longer oscillates between hope and frustration. There is no inner bargaining, no silent pressure to make something happen before time runs out. Desire no longer carries urgency because urgency belonged to the belief that now was insufficient. Abundance, love, and clarity stop functioning as goals and begin functioning as identity. They are no longer things you pursue or protect. They are the context within which experience unfolds. This is why you may notice that outcomes still occur, sometimes even more smoothly than before, yet without the emotional charge that used to precede them. The system no longer needs to rev itself up to receive what it already assumes as natural. The mind may try to interpret this quieting as apathy. It is not. Apathy is disengagement. What you are experiencing is integration. The drive that once pushed you outward has turned inward and settled. Action still happens, choices are still made, movement still occurs, but it is no longer driven by hunger. It is driven by coherence. Nothing has gone missing. Something has been resolved. Desire went quiet because it completed its job. And when a mechanism is no longer needed, it does not announce its retirement. It simply stops operating. Nothing essential was lost in this transition. Awareness did not vanish. Consciousness did not dim. What dissolved was far more specific and far more subtle. The observer position collapsed. And because that position had been quietly running the show for so long, its absence can feel like disorientation if it is not named correctly. The observer is not awareness itself. The observer is a stance. It is the position of standing apart from experience and watching it, evaluating it, manipulating it, attempting to influence it from a distance. That stance was necessary when reality was interpreted through separation. It allowed focus, intention, correction, and control. But it also required constant tension, because maintaining distance requires effort. The observer must stay vigilant. It must monitor outcomes. It must keep checking whether things are working. When that position dissolves, awareness remains, but without the split. Experience continues, but without the internal commentary that asks whether it should be different. Perception becomes immediate instead of mediated. There is no longer a watcher standing behind the experience trying to steer it. There is simply experiencing itself, unfolding without resistance. This is why it can feel unfamiliar. The mind was trained to identify itself as the one doing the observing. When that role disappears, the mind briefly wonders whether it disappeared too. Subject-object mechanics collapse at the same time. There is no longer a clear internal subject acting upon an external object. The distinction softens. This does not mean boundaries vanish in a practical sense. It means the internal tension created by separation is gone. Reality is no longer something you face. It is something you are within. And because of that, effort changes its meaning entirely. Effort, in the old structure, was productive. It was the means by which influence was applied. But effort always carries an assumption. It assumes resistance. It assumes something must be overcome. When you apply effort now, you reintroduce the observer stance. You recreate distance. You implicitly declare that reality is once again external and uncooperative. The system responds accordingly, not by producing results, but by generating distortion. This is why effort now feels like it backfires. It is not that effort has become wrong. It has become incoherent with your current state. It pulls you back into a framework that no longer fits. The body feels this immediately. There is tension, contraction, irritation. Not as punishment, but as feedback. The system is signaling that you are trying to operate from a position that has already dissolved. This can create anxiety if misunderstood. The mind may think it needs to regain control, to re-establish the observer in order to function. But nothing needs to be regained. Functionality does not come from control here. It comes from alignment. When the observer collapses, responsiveness increases. Action becomes simpler. Decisions arise without internal debate. There is less commentary and more clarity. You are still here. You are more here than before. What ended was the layer that stood between awareness and experience. Effort no longer produces results because results no longer require manipulation. They emerge from coherence. Comment with the words, "I am ready," to anchor this timeline. Many people reach this point and quietly conclude that they are regressing. Not because anything is actually deteriorating, but because the mind has lost the storyline it uses to measure itself. For a long time, progress was the reference frame. There was always a sense of moving forward, healing more, manifesting better, understanding deeper. Growth was tracked like a timeline, and identity was reinforced by the feeling of advancement along it. When that storyline dissolves, the mind assumes something must be wrong. The mind is addicted to progress narratives because they provide orientation. They give meaning to effort and justification to struggle. Linear growth creates checkpoints, milestones, before and after comparisons. It answers the question, "Am I improving?" with visible contrast. But linear growth only applies when consciousness is moving from perceived lack toward perceived completion. Once completion stabilizes, linear metrics stop functioning. There is nowhere to advance to. And without advancement, the mind loses its measuring stick. Nonlinear evolution does not look like progress. It looks like depth without movement. It looks like stability without excitement. It looks like fewer internal shifts, not more. This is where misinterpretation happens. The mind expects expansion to feel dramatic, noticeable, and upward. When experience becomes even, quiet, and consistent, it labels the state as stagnation. In reality, what has stabilized is the baseline itself. Stagnation implies blockage. What you are experiencing is saturation. There is no sense of striving because striving is no longer required. There is no sense of breakthrough because there is nothing left to break through. This does not mean awareness has stopped evolving. It means evolution is no longer experienced as change across time. It is experienced as coherence in the present. The belief that you are regressing often appears alongside nostalgia for earlier phases. You may remember periods of intense insight, emotional release, or dramatic synchronicity and compare them to the neutrality you feel now. The mind concludes that something was lost. But what actually happened is that contrast diminished. Peaks feel meaningful only when valleys exist. When the system evens out, the peaks disappear not because awareness declined, but because oscillation ended. Stabilized consciousness is subtle. It does not demand attention. It does not announce growth. It does not generate stories about itself. This makes it invisible to a mind trained to equate significance with sensation. The mind wants proof. It wants evidence of movement. When it cannot find it, it assumes decline. But decline would involve contraction, tension, and loss of capacity. What you are experiencing is expansion without drama. The idea of regression is a projection of an outdated framework. It assumes that growth must always feel like something new is happening. In this phase, growth feels like less is happening, not because awareness is shrinking, but because it no longer needs to signal itself. The system has learned how to operate without constant feedback. Nothing has gone backward. The map you were using no longer applies to the territory you are standing in. Stabilization looks boring to a mind addicted to progress. But boredom only arises when the mind expects stimulation. Presence does not stimulate. It sustains. When you stop measuring yourself against a story of forward motion, the question of regression dissolves. What remains is a steady, unremarkable coherence that does not fluctuate enough to be misread as success or failure. And that steadiness is not a plateau. It is the ground. What is happening now is not a loss of energy. It is a redistribution of it. For years, your nervous system was organized around control. Control of thoughts. Control of emotions. Control of outcomes. Even when that control was framed as spiritual discipline or conscious intention, it still required vigilance. The body learned to stay alert, subtly braced, always ready to intervene if reality drifted off course. That state of readiness became normal, even when it was exhausting. When control is no longer required, the nervous system does not immediately know what to do with itself. It has been trained to equate safety with effort. So when effort drops away, the initial sensation can feel like flatness. Less adrenaline. Less urgency. Less emotional charge. The mind may interpret this as dullness or depletion, but the body is doing something very different. It is recalibrating. Calm, in this phase, is not relaxation after stress. It is coherence after fragmentation. The nervous system is no longer oscillating between anticipation and correction. It is not scanning for threats or opportunities that must be seized before they disappear. That constant microtension dissolves, and what replaces it is a steady baseline. This baseline feels unfamiliar precisely because it is not dramatic. It does not spike. It does not crash. It simply holds. Emotional flatness is often misunderstood here. Flatness sounds like numbness, but numbness is disconnection. What you are experiencing is integration. Emotions still arise, but they do not hijack the system. They move through without pulling attention into loops of reaction. The highs are not as high because they no longer need to counterbalance chronic tension. The lows are not as low because the system no longer believes survival is at stake. This is not less aliveness. It is less volatility. Vitality, in earlier phases, was often confused with intensity. Intensity feels like life because it creates contrast. But intensity is expensive. It burns energy to maintain. When intensity drops, the body conserves. Energy becomes available for presence instead of performance. This can feel strange at first, because the body is no longer signaling engagement through arousal. Yet engagement has not disappeared. It has become quieter and more efficient. Your nervous system is integrating a new identity. It is learning how to operate without constant self-monitoring. That takes time, not because something is wrong, but because the system is releasing habits built over years. Muscles that were always slightly contracted begin to soften. Breathing deepens without instruction. Attention widens instead of narrowing. These changes are subtle, but they are structural. If you try to reintroduce control to feel alive again, the body will resist. Not because control is forbidden, but because it is no longer necessary. The system recognizes that safety no longer depends on effort. That recognition is what allows energy to settle. This settling can feel like slowing down, but it is actually stabilization. Nothing in you has shut down. Something in you has stood down. The part that was always on duty has been relieved. What remains is not less life, but a form of life that does not need to announce itself through tension. The nervous system is not losing vitality. It is learning how to hold it without strain. Fixing is the last habit to fall away because it hides behind good intentions. It rarely looks like control. It looks like responsibility. It looks like self-improvement. It looks like being conscious, aware, proactive. For a long time, fixing was praised. You were taught that if something felt off, misaligned, uncomfortable, the correct response was to intervene. Adjust the mindset. Heal the pattern. Reframe the belief. Optimize the process. Fixing became synonymous with growth. But fixing is still control. It is control wearing a refined language. At its core, fixing assumes something is wrong with what is. It assumes reality needs correction before it can be trusted. That assumption only makes sense when consciousness experiences itself as separate from experience. When you believe you are standing outside reality, fixing feels like stewardship. When separation dissolves, fixing quietly reinstates the distance you just left. Every impulse to fix carries a subtle message: this moment is insufficient. That message reactivates the observer position. It pulls you back into monitoring, adjusting, and managing what no longer requires management. This is why fixing now feels exhausting or pointless. Not because care disappeared, but because interference is no longer coherent with your state of being. Self-improvement follows the same pattern. Improving implies a deficient starting point. It implies a future version that is better, cleaner, more evolved than the present one. That framework was functional when becoming was active. It gave direction to effort. But once arrival stabilizes, improvement becomes self-negation. You are no longer refining from lack. You are expressing from sufficiency. The urge to improve begins to feel hollow because there is nothing fundamental to correct. Allowing is not passivity. It is not resignation. It is the absence of unnecessary intervention. When allowing replaces fixing, reality is no longer treated as a problem to solve. It is treated as a process that self-organizes when not interrupted. This can be deeply unsettling at first, because the fixing impulse provided a sense of usefulness. It gave the mind something to do. Without it, there is a brief sense of irrelevance. But that irrelevance is only to the old role. Allowing does not mean ignoring life. It means responding without preemptive correction. It means letting situations reveal their own intelligence instead of assuming they require your constant adjustment. This is why the last addiction is so subtle. Fixing feels like care. Letting go of it can feel like neglect. In truth, it is trust. You may notice how quickly the fixing impulse arises. A thought appears, and the reflex to adjust it follows. A feeling arises, and the reflex to process it activates. A situation unfolds, and the reflex to optimize it engages. None of these impulses are wrong. They are simply outdated. They belong to a phase where correction was necessary to maintain coherence. Now, coherence holds itself. Intervention creates distortion because it reintroduces the belief that coherence is fragile. Allowing is not something you practice. It is something that remains when you stop assuming reality needs your supervision. The end of fixing is not the end of intelligence. It is the end of micromanagement. When fixing falls away, what remains is a quiet confidence that reality does not need to be improved before it can function. It needs to be trusted. Unity was never meant to be the destination. It was the prerequisite. It was the condition that had to stabilize before something more subtle could emerge. Many teachings stop at unity because unity feels complete, and in a sense, it is. The sense of separation dissolves. The inner conflict ends. The system relaxes. But unity alone does not describe how reality is lived once stability replaces seeking. It only describes what had to happen first. Beyond unity, a different mode of operation becomes available. Not one of effort or influence, but one of structure. This is what can be called the architect phase. Not an identity you claim, and not a role you perform, but a state in which consciousness is no longer busy merging with the field because it is already at rest within it. From that rest, something else becomes apparent. Reality does not need to be pushed or persuaded. It responds to coherence. The architect phase is not about control. It is about lawfulness. It is the recognition that what you are stabilizes patterns simply by being consistent. Coherence, here, is not emotional harmony or positive thinking. It is the absence of internal contradiction. When perception, identity, and response are no longer pulling in different directions, reality organizes itself around that clarity. Not because you force it to, but because coherence acts like a structural principle. This is where power is often misunderstood. Power, in earlier phases, looked like intensity. It looked like focus, will, and the ability to produce change. That form of power always required effort because it relied on force. Force implies resistance. It implies something must be overcome. In the architect phase, power no longer comes from exertion. It comes from stability. From being so internally aligned that there is nothing to push against. Ego often tries to hijack this stage by turning it into a new identity. The idea of being an architect can easily be inflated into a sense of superiority or specialness. But ego always announces itself through comparison and assertion. The architect phase is quiet. It does not need recognition. It does not need to prove anything. Its influence is indirect, subtle, and often invisible to the one embodying it. What changes here is not what you do, but what holds. Your presence becomes the organizing factor. Situations resolve without intervention. Decisions arise without deliberation. Outcomes align without manipulation. This can feel almost anticlimactic, because the mind expects power to feel active. But structural power is passive. Gravity does not strain to pull objects downward. It simply operates. Distinguishing coherence from ego is essential. Ego wants to act. Coherence allows. Ego seeks impact. Coherence creates conditions. Ego needs acknowledgement. Coherence is indifferent to being seen. When these are confused, the system tries to use force again, and friction returns. When they are clear, reality responds with ease. The architect phase is not about designing outcomes in detail. It is about holding a consistent internal state that reality can mirror without distortion. You are no longer working with appearances. You are stabilizing the underlying rules by which appearances arise. This is not mastery in the dramatic sense. It is mastery in the structural sense. Unity brought you home. Stability lets you remain. From that stability, reality reorganizes itself not because you command it, but because coherence is the most efficient configuration available. What changes here is not the outcome, but the mechanism. Manifestation was never wrong. It was appropriate for a phase where reality was experienced as something to be influenced from the outside. In that framework, effort made sense. Focus was applied like pressure. Intention was used to pull one version of reality closer than another. Creation felt active because separation made it feel necessary. Selection operates on a different assumption. It assumes that nothing needs to be built, summoned, or caused. All possible realities already exist, fully formed, complete within themselves. There is no unfinished timeline waiting for your effort to complete it. There are only parallel configurations of experience, each coherent on its own terms. What changes your lived reality is not creation, but inhabitation. Attention replaces effort. Not attention as concentration or strain, but attention as residence. Where you place yourself internally is where experience organizes. You do not make a timeline real by forcing it into existence. You experience a timeline by aligning with it through identity. This is why trying to manifest now feels unnecessary. You are no longer constructing outcomes. You are tuning into contexts. Identity is the access point. Not identity as a personality story, but identity as a stable internal orientation. Who you assume yourself to be determines which version of reality feels natural, accessible, and self-consistent. When identity shifts, attention follows. And where attention rests, that version of reality becomes experiential foreground while others fade into background. Focus, then, is not used to collapse possibility. It is used to remain within a selection. When attention drifts into doubt, fear, or old narratives, the system briefly samples a different configuration. When attention rests in coherence, the experience stabilizes. This does not require vigilance. It requires honesty. You cannot inhabit a reality you do not internally recognize as natural. This is why effort-based creation falls away. Effort implies trying to change what is. Selection implies choosing where to stand. There is no struggle in choosing. There is only clarity. When clarity is present, movement is minimal because there is no internal argument pulling you elsewhere. Timelines do not compete. They do not resist each other. They simply coexist. The one you experience is the one that matches your internal state most closely. This is not a reward system. It is a resonance system. Reality is not responding to what you want. It is reflecting what you are consistently aligned with. This also explains why dramatic techniques no longer work. Techniques are designed to override inconsistency through force. But when identity is stable, force is redundant. The system responds more efficiently to coherence than to intensity. Quiet alignment outperforms dramatic intention every time at this level. Selection does not mean disengagement. You still act, decide, move, and respond. But action is no longer aimed at producing a future. It is an expression of where you already are. You are not trying to get into the right timeline. You are noticing which one you are already inhabiting and allowing it to continue without interference. From this perspective, reality is not something you shape. It is something you step into. And once stepped into, it does not need maintenance. It holds itself as long as identity and attention remain congruent. Language changes once power no longer needs reinforcement. In earlier phases, words were used to persuade, to motivate, to convince the self or reality that something should happen. Affirmations existed to overwrite doubt. Intentions were spoken to generate momentum. Language was a tool applied to a problem. That entire relationship with speech dissolves once unity stabilizes and effort-based creation falls away. After power, language is no longer performative. It is structural. Words stop functioning as emotional encouragement and begin functioning as signals of law. This is not because words themselves are magical, but because speech now reflects identity rather than compensates for insecurity. When identity is stable, words do not reach outward to ask reality to change. They simply state what is. The distinction between request and decree becomes essential here. A request always implies an external authority. It assumes something separate that must decide whether to comply. Even polite requests carry this structure. They position the speaker as dependent on a response. In earlier phases, this made sense because reality was experienced as something to negotiate with. In this phase, requests quietly reintroduce separation. A decree is different. It does not persuade. It does not argue. It does not repeat itself. A decree names a condition as fact. Not in an aggressive way, and not in a dramatic way, but in a settled way. I am functions differently than I want, not because of wording, but because of posture. One assumes arrival. The other assumes distance. After unity, distance is incoherent, and language that implies it loses force. This is why restraint becomes a hallmark of authority. When words are used sparingly, they carry weight. When everything is declared, nothing is anchored. Authority does not speak often because it does not need to correct constantly. It speaks when alignment is clear and silence when silence suffices. Over-explaining, over-affirming, or over-declaring are subtle signs that identity is still being negotiated internally. Precision matters more than volume. Vague language produces diffuse outcomes because it reflects diffuse identity. Clear language reflects clarity of state. This does not mean obsessing over phrasing. It means noticing whether speech arises from certainty or from compensation. If words are being used to feel powerful, they are already misaligned. When power is present, words simply articulate what is already assumed. There is also a shift from future-oriented speech to present-oriented speech. Promises, vows, and intentions that point forward lose relevance. What matters is what is being named now. Language stops projecting and starts confirming. This does not lock reality into rigidity. It stabilizes it. Reality responds more cleanly to what is consistently named than to what is passionately hoped for. Silence gains equal importance. Knowing when not to speak is as significant as knowing what to say. Silence is not absence of authority. It is evidence that nothing needs to be asserted. In silence, coherence holds without reinforcement. This is uncomfortable for the part of the mind that learned to maintain control through narration. But narration is no longer required to keep reality in place. Language after power is not louder. It is cleaner. It does not seek agreement. It does not seek validation. It does not seek response. It simply names. And once named from coherence, reality does not debate it. Not because it is commanded, but because there is no contradiction left to resolve. Individual mastery was never the endpoint. It was the threshold. Stabilizing within yourself was necessary, but it was not meant to terminate experience in isolation. Coherence seeks coherence. Once a field becomes stable, it naturally begins to register other stabilized fields, not as separate agents, but as resonant structures within the same larger system. This is where the conversation shifts from personal evolution to shared reality. When one stabilized field meets another, the interaction is not collaborative in the traditional sense. There is no planning, no intentional co-creation, no negotiation of roles or goals. Those dynamics belong to separation-based interaction. What occurs here is entanglement at the level of state, not behavior. Two coherent systems do not add effort together. They synchronize. And synchronization establishes new baselines without anyone deciding to do so. Post-observer entanglement is subtle because it does not announce itself as connection. It feels more like inevitability. Conversations happen without agenda. Alignment occurs without coordination. Shared understanding emerges without explanation. This is not because individuals are trying to influence one another, but because coherence removes noise. When noise drops away, patterns line up naturally. What changes in these interactions is not intensity, but consistency. When two stabilized fields interact, the shared environment begins to reflect a higher degree of order without force. Conflicts de-escalate faster. Outcomes resolve with fewer steps. Systems reorganize around clarity rather than reaction. No one is trying to lead. No one is trying to follow. The structure reorganizes itself because coherence is more efficient than fragmentation. This is why collaboration narratives do not apply. Collaboration assumes separate agents working toward a shared goal. Entanglement assumes a shared field expressing itself through multiple points of awareness. There is no effort to merge perspectives because perspectives are already aligned at the level that matters. Differences still exist, but they no longer create friction. They become complementary expressions within the same configuration. These interactions can feel strangely ordinary. There is no sense of something big is happening. That expectation belongs to dramatic change models. Structural change is quiet. It alters the rules beneath the surface rather than the events on the surface. When stabilized fields interact, what shifts first is what becomes possible, not what immediately occurs. New baselines of shared reality establish themselves without ceremony. What once required discussion becomes obvious. What once required compromise becomes irrelevant. What once felt complex becomes simple. This is not because intelligence increased, but because interference decreased. The system no longer wastes energy reconciling misaligned states. You may notice that certain people now feel immediately familiar, even if you have never met them before. This is not personal recognition. It is state recognition. The field recognizes itself through coherence. Likewise, interactions that once felt charged may now feel distant, not because of withdrawal, but because resonance is no longer present. This is how collective shifts begin. Not through movements, not through agreement, not through shared beliefs, but through stabilization. Enough coherent fields interacting establish a new default. Reality reorganizes around what is most stable, not what is most desired. Nothing needs to be coordinated for this to happen. It is already underway wherever coherence meets coherence. And it does not require participation. It occurs automatically, as a function of alignment. What is happening now does not require effort because effort would interfere with it. You are not being pushed forward, motivated, or compelled into action. You are being positioned. And positioning feels very different to a system that was trained to equate movement with progress. Pushing involves force. Positioning involves alignment. One creates pressure. The other removes friction. You may have noticed that people, information, environments, and opportunities are appearing without you looking for them. Not dramatically, not urgently, but quietly, as if they were already scheduled. This is not attraction in the old sense. There is no reaching involved. There is no signal being sent out to pull things toward you. What is happening is placement. You are being situated where coherence is already present. Placement occurs when identity stabilizes. Once the internal state is consistent, the system no longer needs to test options through trial and error. Choice anxiety reduces because fewer options feel relevant. Not because possibilities disappeared, but because resonance narrows the field naturally. You are no longer required to evaluate everything. What does not match simply does not register. This can feel unsettling if you are used to deciding your way forward. The mind expects to choose, to weigh, to plan. When positioning replaces pursuit, choice becomes obvious rather than effortful. You are not choosing between paths. You are noticing which path you are already standing on. This removes anxiety not by eliminating responsibility, but by eliminating unnecessary deliberation. Inevitability is often misunderstood here. It does not mean destiny. It does not mean a mission you must fulfill or a role you were born to play. Those narratives still rely on future-oriented pressure. Inevitability, in this context, means minimal resistance. It means events unfold with fewer internal objections. Things happen not because they were meant to, but because nothing is in the way. Being positioned does not mean passivity. You still respond. You still act. But action arises in response to what is immediately present, not from an abstract plan. This makes movement efficient. There is no energy wasted convincing yourself to take steps that are misaligned. If something requires force to initiate, it likely does not belong to the configuration you are currently inhabiting. This also explains why certain doors no longer open, no matter how reasonable they once seemed. It is not rejection. It is irrelevance. Positioning filters options without drama. What does not align simply fails to engage. There is no need to analyze this. Analysis belongs to a phase where alignment was uncertain. You are not late. You are not early. Timing concerns dissolve when placement replaces pursuit. You arrive where you are meant to be only when you stop trying to arrive anywhere else. This does not remove agency. It refines it. Agency shifts from deciding outcomes to responding accurately. As positioning stabilizes, trust becomes practical rather than conceptual. You do not trust because you believe things will work out. You trust because you observe that effort is no longer required to keep things coherent. Life begins to feel self-organizing. Not magical. Not mysterious. Simply efficient. Nothing is pushing you because nothing needs to overcome resistance. You are not being guided toward a goal. You are being held in a configuration that matches what you already are. And from within that configuration, the next movement, if and when it arises, will not need to be forced. It will be obvious. This is where instruction ends, not because there is nothing more to say, but because saying more would pull you back into learning when what is required now is embodiment. Everything that needed to be understood has already been integrated. Anything repeated beyond this point would turn clarity into concept again. The work that begins here is not additive. It is subtractive. It is the quiet discipline of not reaching for explanations when presence is sufficient. Embodiment means you stop checking whether you are doing this correctly. Learning always looks forward. Embodiment rests where you are. You no longer refine yourself through insight. You stabilize yourself through consistency. This is why silence becomes more valuable than information. Silence does not mean withdrawal. It means you are no longer filling space with seeking. When seeking ends, influence begins without effort. You may notice that you feel less inclined to consume teachings, frameworks, or guidance. This is not disinterest. It is saturation. The system no longer needs input to orient itself. Orientation is internal now. When information arrives, it does so contextually, not compulsively. You take in what is relevant and ignore the rest without resistance. This is not discernment as effort. It is resonance as default. At this stage, you function less as a participant and more as a stabilizing node. Not in a heroic sense, and not as a role to perform, but as a structural fact. Your presence carries coherence because it is not trying to change anything. Systems organize around stability automatically. People settle. Conversations clarify. Situations resolve with fewer steps. This is not because you intervene. It is because you do not destabilize the field with urgency or projection. You are not meant to broadcast this. You are not meant to explain it. Networks do not form through persuasion here. They form through recognition. Coherence recognizes coherence without discussion. Those who are ready will register you. Those who are not will pass through unaffected. There is no responsibility to awaken, teach, or lead. Responsibility belongs to effort-based paradigms. Stability belongs to this one. This is also why there is nothing more to prepare for. Preparation implies a future event that requires readiness. What is unfolding now does not arrive as an event. It accumulates as consistency. Day by day, presence holds. Attention remains clean. Language stays precise. Action arises when appropriate and rests when it does not. That is the entirety of the work. You may feel an impulse to look ahead, to ask what comes next. That impulse is the final echo of seeking. There is no next in the way the mind expects. There is only continued inhabitation of what has already stabilized. The more you allow that to be enough, the more quietly influential you become. This script ends here because instruction would now interfere. What remains cannot be taught without being diluted. It can only be lived. You are not moving toward a conclusion. You are sustaining a condition. And that condition is sufficient. Share this with someone who needs to hear it before their timeline closes.